Hello, everyone. This short video lecture is going to cover mortality rates. Mortality rates represent the proportion of patients or the ratio pass away while under care in a hospital. So these rates help facilities track and improve patient outcomes by looking at different potential improvements in care quality. A couple of things that I've already gotten emails about that can be a little bit confusing. The first one is death as a type of discharge. In statistics, a death is a type of discharge or patient disposition, as they sometimes say. It's kind of hard sometimes for people that are somewhat new to healthcare to keep this in mind, as death has obviously a much more somber and serious connotation than a regular discharge. The second one deals with newborn inpatients. Newborns are typically tracked in the gross mortality rates. There may be occasions, depending on what the hospital's actually looking for, where we'll be looking at newborn deaths, and therefore they will be counted separately. These mortality rates are basically the number of cases where there was a death in a hospital, and the denominator is the number of discharges. That's the gross, high level, simple way to calculate. We'll get into some finer details in just a little bit. An important thing to do as you work through these problems is knowing what ones are going to be excluded in the mortality rate calculations. These include patients that come to the emergency room and are dead on arrival. And the reason we exclude these is they're not actually hospital deaths. They're pronounced dead when they arrive in the emergency room, but they were deceased before they arrived. The other one is the emergency department deaths. Patients that pass away in the ER without being admitted are not considered hospital deaths, nor the ones who die in the hospital but were outpatient status, say in the hospital outpatient department. So they're not considered hospital deaths. And then finally, we have fetal deaths. They're calculated typically separately from all the other deaths. So when we talk about the gross mortality rates, what we're talking about is a percentage, and we're looking at the total number of inpatient deaths in the numerator, in other words, the total number, and the denominator is going to be all the discharges. Let's take a look at some of these in your text. And as you can see here, we have the gross mortality rate. This is a total number of inpatient deaths, including newborns in a certain time period, could be a year, a month, a quarter. And the denominator is going to be the number of discharges, including deaths and newborn in a time period. And then we would round that to the nearest tenth and put it in percentages. So in this case, we have 7 deaths, 520 discharges. 7 divide 520 is 0.0134 or 1.3%. Sometimes we want to look at certain types of deaths, say COVID deaths. So in this formula, we would take the number of COVID deaths for patients in a time period and divide it by the number of patients discharged with COVID, including deaths in the denominator in the same time period. So again, the number of COVID deaths for patients, and it could be COVID, could be cancer, whatever the type of death you're looking at, and then the denominator would be the number of patient deaths, discharges associated with that. And notice that the bottom number, the denominator, has to have all the different discharges from that category. So it would be all cancer deaths, all COVID deaths, all AMIs, what have you, as you see here. I hope you found that useful. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or need some help with this material. Thank you.